He was 19 and cast out of Cotton Ridge at gunpoint. No family, no money, no plan, just his father's silver pocket watch and $11 folded into the lining of his coat. 20 years later, James Shaw came back a wealthy man, and one deed at a time, one signature at a time, he began to buy the town that had run him off. But what nobody in Cotton Ridge knew was that inside the old family homestead they had all forgotten about, something waited that would change everything. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from. To understand what James Shaw became, you have to understand what Cotton Ridge took from him, and to understand that you have to go back further still, to the man who raised him, and the woman who was gone before he could remember her face. James was born on a piece of bottomland 6 miles east of Cotton Ridge, on a homestead his grandfather had proved up in the years after the war, and the deed to that land was one of the oldest in the county. His mother, Ruth Shaw, died of a fever when James was 4, and he kept only a single memory of her, the smell of bread and a hand smoothing his hair back from his forehead in a dark room. His father, Elmer Shaw, was a quiet, careful man who worked the same 300 acres his own father had cleared, and who taught James everything he knew about horses, about fence lines, about how to read a sky before the weather turned. Elmer was not a man who spoke often, but when he spoke, he was worth listening to, and James learned early to measure his own words against his father's silence. The mentor in James's life, apart from his father, was an old cattleman named Wesley Barron, who lived alone on the ridge above the Shaw place, and who had lost his wife and only son to the same winter of scarlet fever, 20 years before James was born. Wesley was in his late 60s when James was a boy, and he saw in that grave, watchful child something worth teaching. He showed James how to gentle a green colt without breaking its spirit, how to plait a rawhide rishata, how to shoe a horse that did not want shoeing, how to sit a long saddle without ruining his back, and how to read cattle from a quarter-mile off. He taught him to read weather, to read men, to keep his own counsel, and to never lie about a debt. When James was 12, Wesley gave him a folding stockman's knife, with bone handles worn smooth by 40 years of use, and he told the boy to keep it sharp and keep it clean, and that a man's tools said more about him than his mouth ever would. James still carried that knife, 20 years and a continent of miles later, and he sharpened it every Sunday morning, the way Wesley had taught him. But the Shaws had enemies in Cotton Ridge, and the largest of those enemies was a banker named Halloran, who had wanted the bottomland since before James was born. When Elmer fell from a green horse in the spring of James's 18th year, and broke his hip in a way that would not heal right, Halloran began to circle. There were papers James did not understand, and a mortgage his father had signed years earlier against a bad season, and a note called in when the family could not pay. By that winter, Elmer was dead of pneumonia in a back room of the Cotton Ridge boarding house, and the land was gone, and the Shaw name in the county had gone from an old and respected one to a byword for a family that had failed. Wesley Barron died 2 months later of a heart that had simply worn out, and James, at 19, buried the last 2 men in the world who had loved him and stood alone in a town that had already begun to look at him as an inconvenience, a leftover, a debt that had not quite been settled. He kept only 3 things from that whole vanished life. He kept Wesley's folding knife with its bone handles. He kept his father's silver pocket watch, the one Elmer had inherited from his own father, with the initials E.S. worn nearly smooth on the back. And he kept, folded in an oilcloth pouch inside his shirt, a small tintype of his mother, taken the year before she died, a woman with dark eyes and a plain mouth and a look of quiet patience that James would come to recognize in his own reflection 20 years later, when he had grown into a face that was more hers than he had ever known. The ejection, when it came, did not come with shouting. It came on a Tuesday, in the second week of February, on a morning so cold the water in the horse trough behind the livery had frozen an inch thick, and the smoke from the chimneys of Cotton Ridge stood up straight in the still air, like fence posts. James was living then in a shed behind the feed store, sleeping on a pallet of empty grain sacks, doing what work he could find for men who paid him in coins, and sometimes in a plate of beans. He had a saddle and a bridle, and a bay gelding named Pete that Wesley had left him, and he had the three things he kept against his skin, and he had $11 folded into the lining of his coat, where no drunk or thief was likely to find it. He was standing in the alley behind the feed store, rubbing his hands together over a small fire built in a tin can, when 4 men rode down the alley and reined in and sat their horses looking at him without dismounting. The one in front was a man named Ridley, who kept the sheriff's badge in Cotton Ridge, but kept Halloran's pocketbook closer. And behind him were 3 men James knew by sight and had known since he was a boy. 2 of them had eaten at his father's table. One of them, a man named Purvis, had helped Elmer put up hay the summer James turned 15. They all had rifles across their saddles, and Ridley had his, laid across the pommel, with his hand resting easy on the stock, and he spoke to James the way a man speaks to a stray dog he does not want to shoot, but will if pressed. He said the town had decided. He said there was nothing left in Cotton Ridge for a Shaw, and there would not be, and it would be better for everybody if James was on the road before noon. He said no one wanted trouble. He said the horse and the saddle, and what James could carry, were his to take. And he said, if James was still in the county by sundown, the men behind him would not be asking again. James did not argue. He did not ask which town had decided, or whether Halloran had signed the decision, or whether the men who had eaten his father's bread felt anything at all sitting there on their horses in the cold. He looked at Purvis for one long moment, and Purvis looked at the ground between his horse's ears, and that was all the answer James needed. He nodded once at Ridley. He kicked snow over the fire in the tin can until it was out. He walked past the 4 horses without hurrying, and he saddled Pete in the livery, and he rolled his blanket and his slicker and a small sack of cornmeal and a strip of dried beef into a bundle behind the cantle, and he tied Wesley's old canteen to the horn, and he swung up. The 4 men were still sitting in the alley when he rode past them and out onto the main street of Cotton Ridge, for what he believed then would be the last time. He did not look at the storefronts. He did not look at the bank. He rode down the center of the frozen street at a walk, because to hurry would have been to give them something, and he had given them enough already. He rode west, because west was the direction that was not Cotton Ridge, and because Wesley had told him once that a man who does not know where he is going should at least go toward the country that is bigger than his trouble. The road out of the valley climbed for 3 miles, through stands of leafless cottonwood, and then broke onto a bench of winter grass, where the wind found him, and went through the wool of his coat, as though the coat were cheesecloth. He rode with his chin tucked and his hat brim low, and Pete blew steam from both nostrils, and settled into the long walking gait he could keep up all day. By late afternoon, the ridges behind him had folded together into a single blue line, and the town was gone, as though it had never been. That first night he made a dry camp in the lee of a red sandstone outcrop, and he built a small fire of sage roots and cottonwood twigs, and he ate a piece of the dried beef and drank hot water, because he had no coffee, and he sat with his back against the warm rock, and took Wesley's knife out of his pocket, and opened it, and closed it 3 times, and then he took the pocket watch out and wound it, though it had not stopped, and he listened to it tick against the palm of his hand for a long while before he put it away. He did not weep. Wesley had taught him that weeping in open country was a thing a man did only for the dead, and the dead he had already wept for. He was not dead. He had $11 and a horse and a knife and a watch and a face he had not yet grown into, and that was more than some men rode out of some towns with. He slept sitting up with the rifle across his knees. In the morning there was frost on the blanket and on Pete's mane, and he shook it off and rode on. The country got bigger as he went. It flattened and then broke again into low badlands the color of old iron, and then into sage plain that ran for 2 days without a fence or a wire or a smoke, and he crossed rivers he did not know the name of, and forded them where the ice had thinned at the shallows, and he passed a burned-out roadhouse where crows sat on the chimney, and he passed a wagon train of Mormon freighters who gave him coffee and asked him nothing, and he passed the bones of a horse laid out clean and white in a wash. On the 9th day out of Cotton Ridge, he came down off a rimrock into a town he had never heard of, a rail town on the Union Pacific Line called Bitter Fork, and he stabled Pete for a nickel, and spent another nickel on a bowl of stew, and he sat by the window of the eating house, and watched the trains come in from the East Black, with coal smoke, and going somewhere he did not yet know the name of, and he understood then that Cotton Ridge was not the whole world, and that a man who was nothing in one place might, given time and work and the right kind of quiet, be something in another. He stayed in Bitter Fork through the rest of that February and into March, and he took what work he could find. He mucked stalls at the livery for the man who ran it, whose name was Halcomb, and he split cordwood behind the hotel, and he broke a colt no one else would sit for a rancher named Delaney, who paid him $3 and a meal. He was careful with his coins. He slept in the loft above Halcomb's tack room and paid nothing for the roof, because he did the morning feed. He said little. Men who spoke to him found him civil and short and clean about his work, and by the middle of March, Halcomb had put a word out on his behalf, and there were more days than not when James had a day's work to do. It was Halcomb who told him about the place on Willow Draw. There had been a man named Amos Fielding who had run a small outfit 4 miles north of Bitter Fork on a spring-fed piece of grass between 2 hogback ridges. Fielding had died the previous autumn of nothing in particular that anyone could name. A man in his 70s alone in a one-room cabin, and the county had held the deed against unpaid taxes through the winter and had found no one who would take the place at any price. The land was thin, the roof leaked. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles off. The taxes owed came to $7 and change, and the clerk at the county office would sign the deed to any man who paid them and promised to hold the place through the year. James rode out to look at it on a cold, bright morning in the last week of March. The cabin sat low against the north hogback, where the wind broke over the ridge and passed above it. It measured perhaps 16 feet by 20, built of squared cottonwood logs chinked with clay and horsehair, and the roof was cedar shakes, gone soft along the ridgeline, where snow had sat too long. The door hung on leather hinges dried to bone. Inside, the floor was 2-inch pine plank laid over sleepers, worn dark in a path from door to hearth, and the hearth itself was a slab of native sandstone set in mortar, with a flue of stacked flat stone rising to a chimney that leaned 3 degrees off plumb. There was a rope bed against the north wall, with the rawhide gone slack, a plank table, 1 3-legged stool and 1 4-legged, a shelf holding a tin plate and cup, and a rusted coffee pot, and a horseshoe nailed above the door with the ends up. Behind the cabin was a pole corral, a lean-to shed with a forge in it gone cold and red with rust, a small root cellar dug into the hillside, and, past that, a spring that ran clear from a cleft in the sandstone and made a pool the size of a wagon wheel before running off south into the draw. He walked the place for 2 hours. He stood in the pool water long enough to feel it come through his boots, and knew it would not freeze. He looked at the corral posts, and found 4 he could reuse. He looked at the forge, and saw good iron under the rust. He rode back into Bitter Fork that afternoon and paid the clerk $7.40 out of the 11 he had ridden out of Cotton Ridge with, and the clerk dipped a pen and wrote his name into the book, and James Shaw, at 19 years old, was the owner of 160 acres of thin grass, a leaking cabin, a cold forge, and a spring that would not freeze. He moved onto the place the next morning with his blanket and slicker and cornmeal and rifle, and Halcombe sent him off with a sack of coffee and a slab of bacon owed against work already done. He turned Pete into the corral, set the last 4 sound posts back into the frozen ground, and swept the floor with a broom of cedar twigs lashed with rawhide. He built a fire in the hearth and let it burn all day to drive the winter damp out of the pine, and he sat by it that first night against the cottonwood logs and ate on the tin plate that had belonged to Amos Fielding and drank from his cup, and it was the first roof he had owned in his life. He meant to repair the leaking ridge before the spring thaw, and to do that, he wanted to move the rope bed away from beneath the worst of it. When he pulled the frame from the wall, he found one of the pine planks beneath it had been cut cleanly across and set back down without nails. He knelt and worked the point of Wesley's knife along the seam, and the plank came up in his hand, and in the hollow between 2 sleepers lay a tin box the size of a family Bible, painted once dark green and now speckled brown, with rust along its lid. He carried it to the table and sat down before he opened it. Inside, folded in clean oilcloth, was a canvas sack heavy in the hand and tied with a leather thong, and inside the sack were gold eagles and half-eagles that counted out to $412 on the plank table, and beneath them a folded paper signed by Amos Fielding and a small brass thimble worn smooth with use. The paper said he had lived on Willow Draw 41 years, that his wife Mary was buried under the 2 junipers on the South Rise, that a son had not lived past his 2nd winter, that what was in the box was for whoever came and had need of it, and that the thimble had been Mary's. James read it 3 times and folded it into his coat pocket, and he sat a long while at the table with the coins in a small pile and the thimble beside them, and did not move. He did not spend the money quickly. In the first week of April, he rode into Bitter Fork and paid the year's taxes to the county ahead in full, which came to $9, and he bought a keg of 10-penny nails, a bundle of new cedar shakes, a hand adze, a broadaxe with a hickory helve, a 2-man crosscut saw, 20 pounds of bar iron for the forge, a bellows patched with new leather, and a sack of dried beans and a side of bacon and flour. He paid for what he took and no more, and he kept the rest of the gold in the tin box under the floor where it had been. He worked the roof first. He pulled the old cedar shakes from the north pitch one by one and laid them in the corral, and he found the ridgepole sound but 2 of the rafters punky where the leak had run down them, and he cut those out with the crosscut and shaped new ones from a cottonwood he felled along the draw. He set them with iron pegs he shaped cold on the anvil. And he laid the new cedar shakes from eave to ridge with 4 10-penny nails to a shake, in the pattern Wesley had taught him one summer, when they had re-roofed a line shack together above the Shaw place. He did the same to the south pitch. It took him 9 days. Halcombe rode out in the 2nd week with a wagon of lumber James had ordered on account, and he brought a man named Ned Corley, who was 32 and blacksmithed out of a shop on the east end of Bitter Fork. Corley walked into the lean-to and looked at the old forge and said the firebox was cracked, but usable if James would let him bring a bag of fireclay out the following Sunday. Corley came the Sunday after, with the fireclay, and a nephew of about 14 named Willis, and the 3 of them relined the firebox and rebuilt the tuyere and hung the bellows on new leather straps. And by dusk, James had a working forge, and Corley refused pay and took a plate of beans instead. A woman named Hannah Pruitt, who was 51 and widowed, and kept a small dairy 2 miles down the wagon road, sent a stone crock of butter and a round of soft cheese, wrapped in muslin, by way of her boy, who was 10, and rode a mule, and she told the boy to tell the new man on Willow Draw that a house without butter was not a house. James sent the boy back with a horseshoe he had drawn out of the old bar iron that same morning, cold set at the ends because the forge was still curing, and Hannah Pruitt nailed that shoe above her own door and sent butter every Friday for 11 years afterward. A man named Pettigrew, who was 60 and ran a small band of sheep on the far side of the second hogback, came over one afternoon with a pair of shears and helped James clear the sage from the flat below the spring so the grass could come back. A widow schoolteacher named Miss Aldine Reeve, who was 37 and boarded in Bitter Fork, sent out a wooden crate of books tied with twine, a Bible, a Dickens, a book on veterinary science, and a battered volume on double-entry bookkeeping, and told Halcombe to tell the young man that a shelf was as much a wall as any other. Delaney sent word he had 4 more colts that needed sitting in the fall, and that James was welcome to the work at $3 a head and found. By the end of May, the roof was tight. The corral was full-posted with cedar cut, and hauled from a stand up the draw. The forge threw a straight blue flame. The spring pool had been walled with river stone into a proper cistern, and the 2 junipers on the south rise had been cleared of sage around Mary Fielding's grave, and a plain sandstone marker had been set with her name and her years cut into it by James's own hand with a cold chisel over 3 evenings. He stayed on Willow Draw 7 years. He ran cattle on shares with Delaney the first 3, and on his own account the last 4. He shod horses for the country round, and drew iron for wagons and plows. He kept books in the ledger Miss Reeve had sent, in a hand that grew steadier every year. He married no one, and buried no one. On a June morning in his 26th year, a land agent out of Denver rode up the draw, looking for a man who could read a brand, and read a map, and read a man across a table. And he offered James a partnership in a cattle company that was buying grass in 3 territories. James thought about it 2 nights, closed the cabin, gave Pete's pasture to Hannah Pruitt's boy, put the tin box and its remaining coins into a saddlebag, along with Mary's thimble, wound his father's watch, folded Wesley's knife into his hip pocket, rode to Bitter Fork, took the eastbound train, and did not see the cabin again for 13 years. He was good at the work. He bought grass low in dry years, and sold beef high in fat ones. He learned the language of banks, and the shorter language of men who ran them. He put money into a spur line out of Cheyenne, into a coal seam south of Trinidad, into a mercantile house in Kansas City, and into a bank in St. Louis that he came in time to own outright. He was careful. He never signed a paper he had not read twice, and he never took a dollar he did not mean to answer for, and he never lied about a debt. By his 39th year, James Shaw had more money than the county of his birth had ever counted in one place, and he had never once said the name of the town aloud in the hearing of another man. He came back to Cotton Ridge in the fall of his 39th year, alone, on the noon train, in a gray suit and a plain hat, with a leather portmanteau in one hand and a folded document case under the other arm. He took a room at the same boarding house where his father had died and paid the week in advance, and he ate his supper in the common room at a corner table and spoke to no one, and no one knew him. He walked the main street the next morning in a cold wind and looked at every storefront and every second-story window and every board sidewalk and remembered the shape of the town under snow the day he had ridden out of it. Then he sat down in the office of a lawyer named Hensley, who was young and new to the county and had no history in it, and he laid papers on the desk and began to buy Cotton Ridge one deed at a time. He bought the feed store first, from the widow of the man who had let him sleep in the shed behind it, and he raised her price, and paid her cash, and let her keep the counter. He bought the livery from a nephew of the man who had once run it, and the hotel from a syndicate in Denver that was glad to be shut of it, and the mercantile from two brothers who had let it slide, and the freight office, and the assay office, and the empty lot where the smithy had burned, and the 300 acres of bottomland east of town that had once been his grandfather's, from a man who had bought it from Halloran 14 years before and had never made it pay. He bought Halloran's bank last. He bought it through a shell in St. Louis and a second shell in Chicago, and Halloran, who was 71 and thin and yellow about the eyes, sold it because a note had come due that he could not carry, and Halloran did not know until the papers were signed and the deed was recorded, whose money had bought his life's work out from under him. Ridley, who still wore the badge, learned the same afternoon that the town he policed belonged to a man he had once put on a horse at rifle point, and Purvis, who was 52 and drove a hay wagon for wages, learned it in the street from a boy running with a newspaper. James did not turn any of them out. He raised no rent on any tenant who paid. He forgave 3 mortgages that widows carried, and one that a crippled homesteader carried, and he wrote off the arrears on the boarding house where his father had died, and gave the deed to the woman who had cooked there for 30 years. He let Ridley wear the badge until Ridley took it off himself 6 weeks later and left the county on the westbound. Halloran he never spoke to. Halloran died the following spring in a rented room above the drugstore, and James paid for the burial without his name on the stone and without attending the service. On a clear, cold evening in the second week of December, James rode out alone to the old Shaw bottomland on a bay horse he had bought from Delaney's grandson and stabled in his own livery. The house his grandfather had built was still standing, empty 7 years, the windows boarded, the porch sagging on the south side, the fields gone to sage and cheatgrass. He unlocked the door with a key the lawyer Hensley had handed him that morning, and he went inside. The room smelled of mice and old wood, and the particular dryness of a house that had held no fire in a long time. He walked through every room. He stood a long time in the back bedroom, where his mother had died, and a longer time in the front room, where his father had taught him to plait a lead rope on winter evenings. Then he built a fire in the parlor hearth, from kindling he had brought in his saddlebag, and he sat down on the floor in front of it, because there was no chair, and he took 3 things out of his coat and laid them on the hearthstone in the firelight. He laid his father's silver pocket watch with the initials E.S., worn nearly smooth on the back, and he laid Wesley Barron's folding stockman's knife with the bone handles worn smooth by 40 years and then by 20 more, and he laid Mary Fielding's brass thimble, worn smooth by a woman he had never met, who had sewn in a one-room cabin on Willow Draw for 41 years, and had buried a child under 2 junipers, and had left her thimble in a tin box, for whoever came and had need of it. He set the 3 of them in a row on the sandstone. 2 objects from 2 strangers who had loved children they did not get to see grow, and 1 object from a man who had loved him and had not lived to see him grown either. He sat with them a long time. He did not weep. He had not wept when Ridley put him on the horse, and he had not wept when he read Amos Fielding's paper by lamplight in the cabin on Willow Draw, and he did not weep now. He wound the watch. He opened and closed the knife 3 times. He picked up the thimble and turned it in the firelight and set it back down. Then he put all 3 into his coat pocket and banked the fire and stood up and walked out and locked the door behind him and rode back into town in the dark. He kept the bottomland. He did not farm it, and he did not sell it. He let the sage stand, and he let the grass come back under the sage in its own time. And every spring for the rest of his life, he rode out once in April and once in October, and walked the fence lines his father had walked, and read the sky the way his father had taught him to read it. He lived in a plain two-story house he built on a lot on the east end of the main street, and he kept an office above the bank, and he kept a ledger in his own hand, and he ate his supper in the boarding house he had given away, at the same corner table, and he paid for it every night in cash, because he would not eat on the account of a woman who owed him nothing. In time, the town called him Mr. Shaw, and the children born in the years after his return knew no other name for him, and the old men who had ridden into the alley behind the feed store on a cold Tuesday in February either left the county or grew quiet and did not speak of it, and the story of what had been done to a boy of 19 became a thing that was known and not said, and James let it be known and not said, and asked nothing more of the town than that. James Shaw was 19 and homeless. He had $11 folded into the lining of his coat, and a horse named Pete, and a knife and a watch, and a tintype of a woman with dark eyes, and he was run out of Cotton Ridge at Gunpoint on a cold Tuesday in February by 4 men on horses who did not ask twice. 20 years later, he rode back into the same town on the noon train with a leather portmanteau and a folded document case, and he bought the feed store and the livery and the hotel and the mercantile and the bottomland and the bank, and he forgave more debts than he called in, and he laid a watch and a knife and a thimble on his grandfather's hearthstone in the firelight, and sat with them a long while, and did not weep. It was the best $11 he ever carried, and the best 20 years he ever spent away, and the best homecoming a man cast out at 19 was ever given the patience to make. Cotton Ridge had put him on a horse and told him not to come back. He had come back, and he had brought with him the quiet of Wesley Barron, and the care of his father, and the hope of a stranger named Amos Fielding, and he had made the town that had tried to erase him into the town that carried his name, without raising his voice once. If this story sat with you the way stories of quiet men and long returns are meant to sit, take a moment now and subscribe to the channel, and share this one with someone who has been told they would not come back from a hard place. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and tell us the name of a person in your own life who taught you a skill you still carry, or a stranger whose kindness reached you across years you cannot count. And ask yourself, before the fire dies down and the day goes quiet, what have you been carrying, folded into the lining of your own coat, that one day you will lay down on a hearthstone of your own making, and know at last that it was enough?